Mrs. Johnson stepped from her small red sedan into the bright morning light. The air held a gentle chill, as if it could not decide whether to stay cool or warm. She clutched her brown leather purse close to her side, feeling the soft worn fabric of her gloves. It was Monday, and the bank doors stood tall ahead of her, reflecting the rising sun in their glass panes. She smoothed the navy blue dress she wore, straightened her shoulders, and walked across the sidewalk toward the entrance. Inside, the bank lobby hummed with quiet activity. The cream walls met with brass accents, and a marble floor stretched out like a soft, pale mirror. A few customers stood near the door, clutching papers or tapping on their phones. Rows of chairs formed neat lines against the wall, though most remained empty. Mrs. Johnson moved forward and gave her silver hair a gentle pat. It was a habit she had carried for years, a small gesture of dignity she refused to lose. A young bank assistant in a crisp white shirt and slim tie greeted her. He gave her a curt nod. Mrs. Johnson returned the nod with a gentle smile. She stepped up to the counter and placed her worn leather purse on it. The assistant glanced inside, then shifted his eyes to the teller behind him. "Please wait in the hold line," he said, pointing toward a small area in the corner. His voice was calm but firm. Mrs. Johnson's smile faded slightly, but she nodded in agreement. "Thank you," she replied softly. She walked toward the corner, where a single velvet rope formed a queue line. It was meant for people who needed more time or special service. The sign said the wait could be long. She looked at her watch. 9:02 a.m. The bank opened at 9, and she had arrived on time. She breathed out slowly, reminding herself that she could wait. She had to get her late husband's pension check, and it was a day she had been planning for. Minutes passed. Up a small paperback book from her purse. The cover showed a garden scene, and she smiled at the gentle picture. As she turned the pages, she felt the quiet authority of routine. Reading calmed her. She was always patient. Her husband James had been the impatient one. He would have tapped his foot, looked around, and whispered complaints. "Not today." She sat still in her high-heeled shoes, waiting as the book's words carried her away. At 9:30 a.m., another customer approached the main counter. He was a man in a dark suit, looking focused. The teller behind the glass smiled at him and spoke in a friendly tone. Mrs. Johnson glanced up. That man had just walked in 5 minutes ago, she guessed. And now, he was already inside the teller's window. She returned her gaze to her book. The hold line started to feel narrow. People in regular service lines moved faster. Mrs. Johnson watched 2 younger women chat and giggle in the next queue. They tapped their phones and asked questions. They had been helped and were leaving. Now a tall man in a business suit joined them, and by the time Mrs. Johnson looked up again, he had finished his transaction. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other to ease a slight ache in her back. She reminded herself that her body had served her well for 75 years, and a little ache was nothing. She turned another page of her book. An hour had now passed. She checked her watch again, 10:03 a.m. to customers from the main counter. Waved goodbye to their tellers, Mrs. Johnson still waited. She closed her book for a moment and looked around. The bank manager's office door sat behind the tall counter. The sign read "Manager" in bold letters. Through the glass walls, she could see Mr. Carter's desk, neat and polished, with a small bouquet of fresh flowers in a vase. Mr. Carter himself stepped out. He was a tall man, his tie knotted perfectly, his hair smooth on the sides and flat on top. His eyes scanned the lobby. When they landed on Mrs. Johnson, he gave a small, dismissive nod and walked away without a word. Mrs. Johnson's lips pressed together in a thin line. She returned to her reading. More minutes ticked by. She heard her name called softly through the speaker system. "Mrs. Johnson, can you come to window 3? No one else moved. She looked around and saw the tellers. Windows labeled 1 through 5. 1 and 2 were busy, 3 was empty. She closed her book and tucked it under her arm. She walked forward. At window 3, the teller smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. I'm sorry for the wait." She moved papers around and scanned Mrs. Johnson's purse. I just need to verify some information. Mrs. Johnson adjusted her gloves. Of course, she replied. Her voice was calm, steady, with no hint of frustration. She handed over her identification and a few forms she had filled out at home. The teller glanced at the papers, tapped on her keyboard, then looked up again. I'm so sorry, but you'll need the manager's approval for this withdrawal amount. Johnson nodded. Thank you, she said softly, and stepped back. She returned to the hold line. Now she understood why she had been told to wait. The teller could not serve her alone. She might have a large amount of money to withdraw, or special access. She saw Mr. Carter strolling near the desks, talking on his phone. When she caught his eye, he ended his call, looked her way briefly, and turned away to speak with another staff member. 2 hours passed. Mrs. Johnson felt the ache in her lower back more sharply. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her late husband's warm smile. He would have made her laugh at her predicament. She opened her eyes and smiled at her own memory. That memory was a gift. It filled her with grace. She heard the click of the bank door opening again. Mother and child walked in, the little boy holding a stuffed animal. They went directly to a teller and were served quickly. Mrs. Johnson recognized the teller as the same one who had helped her first. The teller smiled at the mother. Mrs. Johnson felt the weight of the world's rush. Younger families, busy professionals, all moving faster than she did. She was patient, but the silence of waiting felt heavy. By the end of the third hour, whispers began behind her. The customers in the regular lines glanced back and exchanged puzzled looks. They murmured softly about the long wait for Mrs. Johnson, yet no one spoke directly to the bank staff. They looked away when a teller passed by, uneasy. Mrs. Johnson felt those eyes on her. She looked at each whispering pair and gave them a small, gentle nod. They nodded back, guilty and silent. At 12:15 p.m., her name finally sounded again over the speaker. Mrs. Johnson, manager's office, please. Relief swept through her. She folded her book, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward the manager's office door. Her steps were steady and sure. She knew her rights. She had every right to her own pension money. Mr. Carter's office door opened, and he stepped out. His face looked pale, as though he had been caught in a sudden storm. He gestured her inside. Mrs. Johnson, please come in, he said, his voice softer than before. She entered the office, and the bright sunlight followed her in. The walls were lined with framed certificates and photos of the bank at community events. Mr. Carter closed the door behind her. He offered her a seat, but she chose to stand, holding her purse in front of her like a shield of quiet dignity. Mrs. Johnson, I apologize for the long wait, he began. His hands trembled slightly. She listened in silence, her posture calm, her eyes steady on him. He continued, There was a mix-up with approvals. I should have handled it faster. It was my mistake. Her heart softened at his words. She had faced many hardships in her life, war, loss, years of struggle, and she knew the power of an honest apology. Thank you, she whispered. Then she added, May I please complete my transaction now? He nodded. Absolutely. She handed him the forms again. He picked up the phone to authorize. As she watched, she wondered what the board would think if they saw how she had waited alone for so long. She felt a quiet satisfaction at the thought that today might change something for someone else down the line. Maybe no one else of her age would have to wait so long again. The minutes ticked by, and finally Mr. Carter placed the signed approval on his desk. Here you go, Mrs. Johnson. I'm so sorry. She offered a small, forgiving smile. It's done, she said, gathering her purse. Thank you. She left the office at 12:22 p.m., feeling the afternoon sun warm on her back. As she walked toward the bank doors, she paused for a moment and looked back. She saw Mr. Carter standing in the doorway of his office, head bowed. She knew he had learned something important today. Respect costs nothing, and every person deserves kindness. Mrs. Johnson stepped back into the sunlight, her purse secure by her side, and carried with her the quiet power of grace and patience. She had waited for hours, but in those hours, she had held on to her dignity and left a lesson that would ripple through that bank for a long time to come. Mrs. Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk with a calm heart. The sunlight felt warm on her shoulders. She paused for a moment and looked back at the bank building, its glass doors shimmering in the midday light. Inside, Mr. Carter was still standing. At his office door, head bowed. She gave him a small nod of farewell and turned away. Her legs felt tired after 4 hours of standing, but her spirit felt strong. As she walked down the street, she saw familiar faces. Mrs. Patel from the grocery store waved at her. A neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, smiled and tipped his hat. She returned their greetings, her steps steady. Each greeting felt like a reminder that she belonged to a caring community. Her late husband, James, would have laughed at how a bank visit could feel like a parade. She smiled at the memory, clutching her purse a little tighter. Inside the bank, Mr. Carter closed his office door and took a deep breath. His chest felt heavy, as if he carried the weight of his mistake. He glanced at his watch. 12:30 p.m. The board members were due in the conference room in 5 minutes. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and walked down the marble corridor. As he passed window 3, he saw the teller finishing a transaction with another customer. No. He nodded and whispered, "Great job," though his voice shook. What? Conference room door opened before he reached it. 3 board members stood inside, studying reports on their tablets. The chairwoman, Ms. Reynolds, looked up and offered a polite smile. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back into a low bun. Her eyes were sharp, but they softened when she spoke. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Thank you for meeting us on such short notice." He nodded and offered them seats. They sat around a long oak table. The board's papers lay neat and crisp on the surface. The lights overhead reflected off the polished wood. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I called this meeting to discuss our customer service policies." He paused, looking down at his notes. "Earlier today, we had an incident with a longtime customer, Mrs. Johnson. She waited for 4 hours before she received service." Across the table, Mr. Callahan, a board member with kind eyes and a gentle voice, furrowed his brow. "Hours? That is far beyond acceptable. Can you explain what happened?" Mr. Carter met his gaze. "There was a miscommunication in approvals. I take full responsibility. Our staff treated her according to protocol, but I failed to oversee the process." He swallowed hard. "I want to propose a new protocol for special customers and for anyone above the age of 65. Ms. Reynolds leaned forward. "We appreciate your honesty, Mr. Carter, but policy is only as good as its enforcement. I'd like us to consider a training program for every staff member to reinforce respect and empathy." She turned to a younger board member, Ms. Liu. "Sarah, can you draft a proposal for that training?" Ms. Liu nodded and tapped on her tablet. "Yes, Chairwoman. We'll have a draft by tomorrow morning," Mr. Callahan added, "and we should publicly acknowledge this mistake. Our customers need to know we care about their dignity." Mr. Carter hesitated, feeling the weight of exposure, but he knew honesty would rebuild trust. "I agree. I will issue a formal apology and invite Mrs. Johnson and other seniors for a listening session." He looked up. "The board agrees. We can schedule an event next week." The board members exchanged nods. Ms. Reynolds smiled warmly. "It sounds like a good start. Let's move forward with these actions." Mr. Carter exhaled, relief lightening his chest. That afternoon, the bank's marketing manager prepared an official apology letter. The letter began with a sincere statement of regret and described steps being taken to improve service. It invited seniors to a special breakfast event at the bank branch on Thursday at 9 a.m. Everyone above 65 would be welcome, free of charge. The letter offered to reserve seats and provided a contact number, ended with a promise: respect and dignity for every customer. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Johnson found the letter slipped under her door. Her granddaughter, Mariah, had visited. Earlier to help with housework, Mariah picked up the envelope and handed it to her grandmother. "Grandma, look what came for you," she said, her eyes curious. Mrs. Johnson opened the letter slowly. She read each sentence in simple, clear words. When she finished, she looked up at Mariah, her eyes shining. "They want me to come for breakfast," she said, Her voice was soft but firm. "I suppose I should go." Mariah hugged her. "You must, Grandma. You made a change." Mrs. Johnson smiled, adjusting her shawl. "Then I'll be there." On Thursday morning, the bank lobby filled with seniors. Tables lined the walls, each topped with coffee urns, plates of muffins, fruit bowls, and small bouquets of wildflowers. A banner read Senior Appreciation Breakfast. Mrs. Johnson arrived early. She wore her navy dress again and carried fresh flowers in her hands. She greeted each staff member with a nod. Some smiled, others blushed as they remembered her weight. Mr. Carter stood near the buffet, greeting guests. When he saw Mrs. Johnson, he stepped forward. His face showed both respect and apology. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for coming." She placed her flowers in a vase nearby. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. He gestured toward a table. "Please, sit here with me." She hesitated, then sat. Mr. Carter placed a plate in front of her. He filled her cup with coffee and offered a muffin. "I owe you my deepest apology," he said. "Your experience was unacceptable. I hope today shows our commitment to change." She looked at him calmly. "I understand mistakes happen. Today, I see you are making things right. That is what matters." He nodded, grateful for her kindness. As breakfast proceeded, other seniors shared their stories. A former teacher spoke about times she waited for help receiving her savings. A retired mail carrier told of how bank staff once struggled to understand his heavy accent. Each story ended with smiles and gratitude for the new training promise. Mr. Carter listened, taking notes. The board members circulated among tables, introducing themselves and thanking guests. At 9:30, Ms. Reynolds stood to speak, cleared her throat, and held up a hand for silence. The room hushed. She addressed the gathered crowd in simple words. "Today we honor you, our valued customers. You built this community, and you deserve our respect." She described the new training program, the senior-only service line, and monthly listening sessions. "Together, we will ensure that every visit to this bank is a positive experience." Mrs. Johnson listened, feeling connected to the room. She saw faces nodding and heard soft applause. Her heart swelled. This was more than an apology. It was a change that would last. She thought of James, her husband, and how proud he would have been to see her here, helping others find their voice. After the speech, a young bank employee approached. Mrs. Johnson with a small gift, a journal bound in soft leather. The employee explained that customers would use it to note any ideas or concerns. To help the bank improve, Mrs. Johnson accepted it gratefully and signed the first page with her name and a short note. "Respect is a gift we share." As the event ended, guests filed out with sandwiches in hand and smiles on their faces. Mrs. Johnson and Mariah walked home together. Mariah chattered excitedly about how Grandma had helped everyone. Mrs. Johnson listened, her steps light. She felt a sense of accomplishment, like a stone thrown into a pond, creating ripples far beyond her own circle. That evening, Mrs. Johnson sat by her window, looking out at the darkening sky. She opened the journal and read her note again. She thought of the morning speeches, the warm laughter, and the firm handshakes. She closed the journal and placed it on her bedside table. Her heart felt full. In the days that followed, Mr. Carter's bank became known for its senior-friendly service. Word spread to neighboring branches, and soon the policy changed system-wide. Frontline staff received regular empathy training, and senior customers across the region spoke of new, respectful treatment. Mrs. Johnson returned to the branch once more, this time for a routine deposit. She was greeted promptly, offered a seat, and served with warmth. As she left, she tapped her purse to make sure her checking account card was still inside. She realized that sometimes a simple act of patience and dignity could change many lives. Under the same clear sky, she walked away, carrying with her the quiet power of hope and the knowledge that her small act had made the world a kinder place. Mrs. Johnson woke early the next morning, the soft light of dawn filtering through her lace curtains. She sat by the window with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the birds gather on the fence outside. The world felt peaceful, as if it had shifted just a little because of her actions. She smiled and took a slow sip, thinking of the breakfast event at the bank. The quiet warmth of that room still stayed with her. She dressed in her favorite green cardigan and polished her shoes. Today she planned to visit the senior center, where she volunteered twice a week. She arranged her purse and tucked the small leather journal inside. On its first page, she had written her promise about respect. Now, she carried both journal and promise with pride. When she arrived at the center, the hall buzzed with activity. Tables were set for card games, and laughter rang out from the knitting corner. Mrs. Johnson greeted each friend with a gentle nod or a soft good morning. Mrs. Patel was there, balancing cups of coffee on a tray. Mr. Alvarez was seated. At the table where Domino's waited, they all smiled when they saw her. "Good to see you, Mrs. Johnson," said Mr. Alvarez. "You look bright today," she smiled back. "Thank you," she said. "I feel bright." At her usual spot, she set down her journal and joined a small group learning how to use smartphones to video chat with family. One woman struggled to open the app. Mrs. Johnson leaned over and showed her how to tap the screen. "Right there," she said kindly. The woman laughed in relief when her granddaughter's face appeared. Mrs. Johnson cheered with the group. After the lesson, she stood and spoke quietly into the room. "Friends," she said, "this week I saw how we can change things even when we feel small. We must speak up, and we must listen to each other." Her voice was gentle but strong. Everyone fell silent, nodding and listening. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Johnson and Mariah walked through the town's Central Park. Mariah carried a small recorder and asked questions. "Grandma, what did you feel when they called your name? The third time?" Mrs. Johnson paused under an oak tree and looked at the sky. "I felt tired," she admitted. "But I also felt certain that I deserved fairness. Each of us deserves fairness." Mariah nodded and clicked off the recorder. They visited the bank branch afterward. Mrs. Johnson wanted to thank the teller who had first greeted her that day. The teller, Ms. Lee, recognized her immediately and gave her a bright smile. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, "it means so much that you came back." She gave Mrs. Johnson a small bouquet of daisies. "For you, for all you did." Mrs. Johnson accepted the flowers and felt a warmth in her chest. "Thank you," she said. She thought of how small kindnesses could grow. Across town, the bank manager's office held a new plaque on the wall. It read, "In honor of Mrs. Clara Johnson's champion of respect." Mr. Carter stood before it, reading the words quietly. He touched the plaque with his fingertips. On his desk lay the small leather journal that Mrs. Johnson had used. He opened it to read her note again, felt both humbled and inspired. That evening, news of Mrs. Johnson's story reached local papers and radio. An interviewer asked her over the phone how she had stayed calm. Mrs. Johnson's voice floated through speakers into homes across the region. "I remembered my husband's guidance," she said softly. "He always told me that kindness and patience help us see the good in people." Listeners called in, sharing their own stories of kindness at banks, grocery stores, and bus stops. The next week, Mrs. Johnson received an invitation to the mayor's office. She entered a bright room with sunlight pouring in. The mayor, a friendly woman named Ms. Gomez, stood to greet her. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, "your actions have changed our town for the better. I'd like to give you this key to the city. In honor of your patience and courage," she handed Mrs. Johnson a small silver key on a ribbon. Mrs. Johnson clasped the ribbon, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. She thought of James, her late husband, and prayed he would be proud. Ms. Gomez smiled and led her back to her seat. Photographers took pictures as Mrs. Johnson held the key, her gentle smile shining. In the days after that ceremony, the senior center named a reading nook Clara's Corner. It held comfortable chairs, a small shelf of books, and a brass plaque with her name. Mrs. Johnson visited it often, reading or chatting with friends. She liked to say that kindness could fit in any corner. At home one afternoon, Mariah showed her a sketch she had made. It was a drawing of Mrs. Johnson standing tall inside the bank, surrounded by people nodding and smiling. The caption read, "Respect is simple." Mrs. Johnson hugged the sketch. "It is simple," she said, "yet we forget it." Months passed and life settled into a gentle rhythm. The bank's new senior line moved quickly. Staff greeted each person with kindness. The training program spread to other branches. Mr. Carter visited the senior center to speak about leadership and respect. He held Mrs. Johnson's journal in his hands, telling young employees, "Learn from her grace." One morning, Mrs. Johnson prepared for a trip to the state capitol. A bus carried seniors interested in sharing their stories with other bank branches. She sat with Mrs. Patel, Mr. Alvarez, and a few new friends. They laughed and talked about breakfast foods and weather. Mrs. Johnson looked out the window at fields of green and gold, feeling gratitude in her heart. When they arrived, a small crowd greeted them. The state bank governor welcomed Mrs. Johnson and her friends onto a stage. He spoke of courage and change, urging leaders to listen to seniors across the state. Mrs. Johnson stood quietly at the side, feeling both shy and proud. When the governor finished, he motioned to her. She walked forward, placed her hand on his arm, and whispered, "Thank you for listening." The governor nodded. "It is because of you that we must listen." After the event, Mrs. Johnson returned home. She found a letter waiting on her dining table. It was from a pen pal in another town who had read her story. The letter said, "You inspire me to speak up." Mrs. Johnson sat down and wrote back, "Speak up, yes, but always with kindness." She sealed the envelope with a gentle press. That night, she attended her church service. The pastor spoke about light and hope. He said, "One small light can guide many." Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes and remembered her wait at the bank. She felt that light inside her still glowing. Before bed, she opened her journal and wrote another note. Kindness is the seed of respect. Plant it everywhere. She closed the cover and set the journal on her bedside table. She lay back and looked at the ceiling, feeling peace. In her dreams, she saw the bank lobby filled with flowers and smiling faces. She heard laughter and soft whispers of thanks. She felt the gentle touch of community, the steady beat of change, and she knew that her small act of patience had grown into a garden of respect for many to tend. When dawn came again, she rose and prepared for another day of volunteering, of speaking up, of kindness. The world outside her window awaited, full of new opportunities to plant seeds of respect. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward once more, carrying her purse, her journal, and the quiet power of grace. Mrs. Johnson woke before dawn once more, her mind steady with purpose. She dressed in soft beige slacks and a light lavender sweater, feeling the calm energy that came from each new morning. She picked up her purse and the small leather journal, now thick with notes and memories. Today, she would meet with a group of seniors at the community library to help them write letters to the editor about respect and kindness. The library's front doors opened at 8, and Mrs. Johnson was among the first to arrive. Inside, long wooden tables stood waiting, and soft sunlight streamed through tall windows. A librarian, Ms. Turner, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. We're all ready for you." Mrs. Johnson nodded, placing her journal on the table and smoothing it closed. She looked around at the dozen chairs, each marked with a name tag. Soon, seniors filed in, greeting one another with hugs or gentle nods. One man, Mr. Lewis, used a cane, but walked with strong steps. A woman named Mrs. Ramirez carried a stack of stationery. Mrs. Johnson welcomed them with a bright "Good morning, friends." Her voice felt like a soft bell in the quiet room. They settled into their seats. She passed out pens and notepaper. She began by telling them about the breakfast event at the bank, about how a simple apology and a listening ear had changed so much for so many. As she spoke, the seniors leaned, in eyes shining with hope. When she finished, she said, "Now it is our turn to speak to others, to share our message of respect." She wrote on a large pad at the front, "Respect costs nothing." Then she asked, "Who wants to try?" First sentence. Hands rose. Mrs. Ramirez spoke softly, "Every person deserves to be treated with kindness." Mrs. Johnson nodded and wrote those words below the title. Mr. Lewis added, "Age is only a number, but respect is forever." They laughed in agreement. One by one, they composed short statements, their pens moving earnestly across the paper. Mrs. Johnson walked among them, offering gentle suggestions. Perhaps add an example, or that feeling is important. An hour passed, and the stack of letters grew. Each letter started with a memory, a teller's friendly smile, or a neighbor's helping hand, and ended with a call to action. Let us all share respect each day. When they finished, she collected the letters and promised to mail them that afternoon. "Your words matter," she said. "They will reach readers who need to hear our story." After the meeting, Mrs. Johnson returned home to find Mariah waiting with tea. They sat at the kitchen table, and Mariah asked, "Grandma, what did you feel in that room today?" Mrs. Johnson stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I felt strength," she replied. "When we speak together, our voices grow louder." Mariah scribbled notes, her eyes bright. Later, Mrs. Johnson walked to the mailbox and dropped the letters in. She stood quietly, watching them disappear into the slot. She thought of each writer's hope that readers far and wide would learn. The simple power of respect. The sun warmed her back, and she felt a quiet joy. That evening, the bank's senior appreciation line had become a steady stream of friendly faces. But word of Mrs. Johnson's letter-writing group had reached Mr. Carter's ears. He called her at home, asking if he could visit. He arrived at her doorstep 10 minutes later, holding a small box of pastries. "I hope these are all right," he said. "I wanted to thank you again." Mrs. Johnson welcomed him inside. She poured coffee into delicate cups and offered a muffin. Mr. Carter took a seat across from her, placing the box on the table. "I read about your library meeting," he began. "I was so impressed by how you guided everyone." He paused. "I'd like to share your letters with our staff at next week's training. Would that be all right?" She smiled, pressing her hands together. "I would be honored," relieved, his shoulders easing. "I want everyone to hear your words themselves. It will mean more than any presentation I could give." They spoke quietly, planning how he would introduce her letters, then said their goodbyes with warm handshakes. The following Tuesday, Mr. Carter stood before a room of bank employees. He held one of the letters in his hand. He told them about Mrs. Johnson's story, how she waited for her pension, how she stayed calm, how she inspired an entire community. Then he read the letter aloud. "Every person deserves to be treated with kindness." He let the words sink in. The staff sat in thoughtful silence. Afterward, he invited Mrs. Johnson to join him on stage. She walked forward in her green cardigan, holding her journal. The room broke into gentle applause. Mr. Carter nodded to her. She spoke in her calm, steady voice. "Thank you for listening. Respect costs nothing, but it gives so much. Let us carry kindness in every act." The applause grew louder, and she returned to her seat, feeling a lightness she had never known. Outside the bank that day, a group of staff members chatted among themselves. "I never knew how small actions could help," said one teller. "Going to smile first?" said another. Even the new recruits spoke of changing their tone and offering extra help to anyone who seemed unsure. Back at home, Mrs. Johnson wrote in her journal, "Together, we can teach respect." She paused and looked at her reflection in the window. She thought of how her life had changed in these weeks, how her quiet action had turned into a tide of kindness. She closed the journal and placed it carefully on her bedside table. One morning, she noticed a brochure on her front porch. It was from the local school district, inviting seniors to share life lessons with students. The cover showed a child and an elder holding hands. She smiled and called the number inside. She signed up to visit a 5th grade class the following Friday. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Johnson entered a bright classroom filled with colorful art and eager faces. The students sat in a semicircle, their eyes wide. She told them her story, using simple words and gentle humor. She spoke of waiting, of dignity, and of speaking up with kindness. The children listened intently, nodding as she spoke. Afterward, they asked questions. "How did you stay calm?" one student asked. "Did you feel angry?" Another wanted to know. She answered each with honesty. "I remembered what my husband taught me, and I knew it was better to be patient than upset." Then she invited them to draw a picture of kindness. The room burst into color as crayons moved quickly across paper. Before she left, the teacher thanked her. "You've shown them something important today." Mrs. Johnson felt her heart swell. As she walked home, she thought of the children's drawings, hearts, handshakes, and smiling faces. She felt hope that the next generation would carry this lesson forward. That weekend, a local tea shop displayed the children's drawings in its window, with the caption, "Kindness begins here." Passers-by stopped to look, and many smiled. Inside, Mrs. Johnson's favorite table held a pile of letters from strangers, thanking her for inspiring change. She read one, "Your story reminded me to say please and thank you more." Another said, "I held the door open for someone who needed help." She folded the letters and placed them in her journal. On Sunday evening, she and Mariah sat together under a quilt on the sofa, played a soft melody on the piano. Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. Contentment and quiet pride. When the melody ended, she opened her journal and wrote a final line for the week. "Kindness spreads from one heart to another." She closed the cover, and Mariah turned off the lamp. In the soft glow of the room, Mrs. Johnson lay back and smiled, ready to dream of tomorrow's small acts of respect. Mrs. Johnson woke on a clear Monday morning, feeling a gentle excitement. Today was the day she would visit the bank branch one more time, this time, not as a customer, but as a guest speaker for a staff meeting. She dressed carefully in a soft blue dress, the color of calm skies, and polished her sensible shoes until they gleamed. She tucked her leather journal into her purse, along with a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from her garden. When she arrived at the bank, the lobby seemed brighter than ever. Freshly painted walls glowed under the lights, and a new sign by the door read, "Welcome, valued customers of every age." She smiled, her heart warm with pride. Young teller, whom she had never met before, greeted her by name. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," the teller said. "We're so happy you're here." Mrs. Johnson followed the teller through the quiet hallways to a spacious conference room. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a podium stood at the front. She placed her flowers on a small table next to the podium and opened her journal. To the first page, she saw her earliest note. "Kindness is the seed of respect." She touched the words gently, then closed the journal. Soon Mr. Carter entered with a handful of staff members. He introduced Mrs. Johnson with warmth. "This is the woman who taught us all a lesson in kindness and respect," he said, his voice proud. The staff applauded softly. Mrs. Johnson felt a flutter of nerves, but she took a slow breath and smiled. She stepped to the podium and looked out at the faces. Some were new hires, some were tellers she had met before, and a few were managers from other branches. She began in her calm, steady voice. "Thank you for inviting me today," she said, when I waited for my pension check. "I did not know that my small act of patience would lead to all of you bringing kindness into every moment." She paused and looked at the bouquet. "These flowers remind me that a single gesture can grow into something beautiful." She spoke about the long wait, about how she felt when she was ignored, and about the apology that changed everything. She shared how the training program grew, how the letters reached newspaper readers, how teachers and children learned respect in classrooms. She told them about the drawings in the tea shop and the key to the city from the mayor. She spoke of the reading nook at the senior center and the children's laughter in her 5th grade visit. With each memory, the room grew quieter and smiles spread across the faces before her. Then she shared a new insight. Kindness and respect are not one-time actions. They are habits we must practice every day. Like watering flowers, we water respect with simple words and small deeds. She looked around and invited questions. One teller asked, "Mrs. Johnson, what if someone still seems impatient or rude?" She nodded with understanding. We cannot control others' actions, but we can control our own. By showing respect, we often calm the storm in another person's heart. Another manager asked, "How do we keep this going as more people join our team?" Mrs. Johnson thought for a moment. "Share stories," she said. "When someone helps you or shows kindness, tell someone else about it. Celebrate those moments." Kindness grows when it is noticed. She closed her journal and placed it gently on the podium. "And remember to listen. What's simplest?" act of respect is to give someone our full attention. When the meeting ended, the staff came forward to thank her. One by one, they shook her hand or offered her small gifts: a pen engraved with kindness, a framed photo of the team, a handmade bookmark with a flower pressed inside. Each gift carried a message they would remember. Mrs. Johnson accepted each with a soft thank you and tucked them safely into her purse. On her way home, she stopped by her favorite park bench under the oak tree. She sat and opened her journal to the blank page at the end. With her own pen, she wrote, "Respect is our daily gift to the world." She closed the journal and leaned back, watching sunlight dance through the leaves. A gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and fresh grass. Later that afternoon, Mariah arrived with news. "Grandma, I heard the bank branch 2 towns over started the same program because of your story," she said excitedly. "They invited you to speak there next month." Mrs. Johnson's eyes lit up. "Really?" she asked. Mariah nodded. "They read your letters and the news articles. They want to learn how to be kind, just like your bank did." Mrs. Johnson smiled, touching Mariah's hand. "Then I will go," she said. "I will share our story again." That evening, at home, she opened the small photo album Mariah had made. It held pictures from the bank breakfast, the library meeting, the school visit, and the mayor's ceremony. Each photo showed people smiling, hands clasped, eyes bright. She lingered on a picture of herself standing at the podium in the conference room. She looked calm and joyful, surrounded by attentive faces. She closed the album and placed it on the shelf next to her bed. As she prepared for sleep, she thought of the many people whose lives had touched hers: the teller who first apologized, the board members who listened, the children who learned respect, and the bank staff who practiced kindness every day. She realized how a single person's patience could spark change across a whole community. Just before drifting off, she looked at the small bouquet she had brought to the bank that morning. The flowers still stood fresh in a simple glass jar by her bedside. Their bright colors glowed in the lamp's soft light. She whispered a final thought: "May these blossoms remind me always to water respect." With that, she closed her eyes and let peaceful dreams carry her into the next day, knowing she had helped plant seeds that would grow far beyond her own garden.